Right. Good evening, everyone. We're starting our second of our series of webinars addressing parents' concerns about the climate crisis. And today's topic is something that I think is quite close to the heart for many adults who spend a lot of time thinking about climate change and what you could do about it. But I think what's also important to realize is that the youth and children, many of them are also thinking about the climate crisis and also having some of the emotional reactions that we do as adults. So today, I think it's of great pleasure that we've managed to invite two psychologists and professors from James Cook University to be able to help us understand what is it that we should think about when children have emotional responses to something as important and so fundamental to our way of life as a climate crisis. But also, what is it that you could do to help to build resilience in your children? Not necessarily just your children, but the younger generation around us as well. So I'll just do a quick introduction of our two speakers today before I hand over. First up today, Dr. Denise Dillon, Associate Professor of Psychology at James Cook University. Her primary research focus is on biophilia. Biophilia means a love of life and lifelike processes. And in her time here teaching at James Cook University, she has commented on several times on climate-related anxiety and behaviours for the Straits Times and Channel News Asia. Denise is also a certified forest therapy guide, one of the three pioneers of forest therapy guiding here in Singapore. And the second speaker that we have today is Dr. Natasha Riyad. She's the psychology clinic manager at James Cook University, Singapore. She's a clinical psychologist, specializes in child development and mental health and parenting. So the clinical areas of her interest include anxiety and a universal prevention of mental health issues. So today we're very happy that both of you are here with us today. Very much welcome. To kick off this evening, we'll have two presentations by Dr. Denise Dillon and Dr. Natasha Riyad. And so I hand over to Denise right now to go through some of your thoughts around building resilience in children as we think about the climate crisis and how we relate to the environment.
Thanks so much for the invitation. I'd love having climate conversations, and I love speaking with you, Xinyi. So my presentation will focus on a lot of the resilience that I think we need to develop in children. So yes, we need to manage anxiety, but Natasha and I are in agreement that if we don't have any anxiety, we won't do anything. So I think the important keynote, the key word here is managing climate anxiety. It's not just taking it away because, as I say, if we're not anxious at all, we won't bother doing anything. So let's go on to our first slide, please. I'd like to begin with this concept of coping with change, because we're talking about climate changing. And we know that climate changes all the time. It's cyclical, it's seasonal, there's things that happen. And even here in the tropics, we do have seasons. We like to, in some ways, deny that we have seasons by saying, well, it's always hot. But actually there is change. And part of what we need to understand with ourselves and with children is, how do we ourselves deal with loss or change in our lives? So if we think about coping with change, it can be really traumatic because it affects many parts of our lives. It affects our emotions, but it can affect our thoughts as well. And it even sometimes affects us unconsciously, and we can become traumatized and start acting out in ways that are unusual without realizing it ourselves. So what we want when we have trauma is we want to find some kind of resolution to that. we want to resolve the grief or the trauma. And we need to find a sweet spot, because sometimes we can put all of our focus on our trauma and just that's all we think about. Or others take the alternative route and deny that they're feeling any kind of trauma. And if we're talking about climate, it can come to something like what's depicted in the picture here with the adult and the child. The water is actually rising up towards them. And if they just ruminate and think about their trauma all the time, they risk losing sight of that water creeping up and, potentially taking over and flooding them. And if they really go into avoidance or denial, same thing. They'll deny that the water is going to do anything to them or change their lives until it's too late and they're actually finding themselves swimming and potentially drowning. So what we need to do, as I say, is find some ways to resolve these problems. Now, change often comes with loss. Let's go to the next slide. And with loss, this can be a transformation or a destruction of our physical environment, our home. And when I say home, I mean that very broadly. So in Singapore, our home is not just the HDB, not just the condo. It can actually be part of the physical environment that is all of Singapore, beaches, forests, everything. And so when we lose forest environments, as happens quite often, we can feel that as a sense of loss, as a sense of our identity is lost in some way. Glenn Ulbrich is a philosopher in Australia, and he coined a term called solastalgia. And what he's talking about here is something that's desolation, and we want to resolve this desolation and get rid of it. So solastalgia, Ulbrich says, is the pain or sickness caused by the loss or lack of solace, and the sense of isolation connected to the present state of one's home or territory. Now, if we think about that desolation from the loss of a physical environment, that comes from a powerful feeling that is from our attachment or our connection with that home environment, which is a good thing when you think about it. It's lovely to feel connected to things and to have an attachment to it, but we won't get that attachment unless we come to learn about it and experience it. Let's move on to the next slide. So when we find ourselves in this place of desolation and loss, so if you think about people worrying about losing Dover Forest or Clementi Forest, the loss of the scrub woodlands at Woodlands, and so people worry about things that they've lost, and we need to find ways that we can embrace that there is a loss and understand how we deal with that. And all of this, I'm relating this about environments because it's relating to climate change. Climate change comes from a consortium of many things, and I'm going to get further and further into understanding that as we move along. But mourning rituals can be something that we're very familiar with. So if we think about losing people, losing a loved one, we know that there's mourning rituals associated with that. But we're not so familiar with rituals that are associated with losing forests or losing land or losing a familiar environment. So funeral rites and mourning rites associated with human death are very much embedded in cultural memory. We know what to do. We can recognise that. They've got a structure. They've got a recognisable pattern of activities when we're feeling bewildered and we're feeling disoriented. And so those rituals can help reorient people who seek to retain a connection with what's lost. And for humans, it's with their loved one. They think about and celebrate all of the wonderful times they shared with that person, for instance. So we need to find rituals or rites of passage to help people experience ecological loss, to help us reorient ourselves and to re-inhabit that sense of identity that we have, the connection that we have with environments around us. And this is often a unique experience to each person because my interaction and connection with forests is different from yours. All of my listeners have their own unique experiences. Let's move to the next slide. And so one of the recent examples of a morning ritual that had to be invented because a glacier had never died before. It's unfortunately, very tragically, we have lost a glacier in all of human experience. This has never happened. And a memorial service was held for the glacier. And when we say memorial service, it's because it's one of those recognized rituals for human deaths. And the outstanding component of that was no ritual for a glacier existed on which to draw from, because that hadn't occurred in all of human recognition. So we've said goodbye to so many things and to so many people, but never before to a glacier. And so what they did was they came together as a community and put a plaque to recognize that this came from human action, had actually resulted in the death of this glacier. And so it's an acknowledgement for all future generations that this was human caused. Let's move on. So when we think about these rituals, and we might think, well, it's only very recent, but even back in the 90s, Phyllis Windle is an ecologist, and she suggested that we needed morning rituals for those who are working at the coalface of this, so to speak. So the ecologists who actually measure changes in the environment and can see the loss of biodiversity and actually experiencing grief over what they were measuring in their scientific measurements. So she suggested some practical and positive suggestions that involve a willingness to move through the work of ecological grief, and so we can work towards that resolution. And I think these are some things that we can actually use now, even with children. So, for instance, we could hold a wake for a precious piece of land. If we're living near Dover Forest or near Clementi Forest, or if we visited them and we really loved them, and when they're lost, we could do our own wake for that piece of land and gather to tell stories of what that place provided for us. And that's a recognition of understanding that places do provide for us. We could create a family album filled with recollections from our grandparents. And that takes us back through history and the history of our grandparents and helps us connect to the feelings that they had about the natural areas and their experience, which can help us understand also the changes that do occur over time. We can celebrate and affirm our faith in the processes of ecology and evolution. So understanding how processes work. And evolutionary time is very long and very slow. And we expect things to happen very fast. And that's one of the things about climate change. It isn't happening now. It's not flooding us. It's not smothering us. It takes time to understand how this is actually going to affect us. And we can also note the remaining beauty of the earth, of new species and subspecies and all those wonderful grand rhythms that are associated with the different cycles. Let's move on to the next slide. So a Noticing Nature report in the UK unfortunately recognised that a small portion of children often stop to look at the stars or moon. Most children infrequently or never listen to bird song. Most adults infrequently or never smelled the wildflowers. And if adults aren't doing it, why would children? More than 50% of young people said they were worried about nature's decline, more than a year ago. And most adults agree that it's important. There are strong laws to protect nature in the UK. So I know this is UK oriented, but we're still seeing there's a bit of a disjunct that people are saying they're worried, but they're not actually noticing nature very much. Let's go to the next slide. So what we need is interactions with nature. As a species, we're losing this rich and diverse form of interaction with nature. So Khan says when we're not getting this awe of encountering an animal in the wild or a slug underfoot or of sleeping under the night sky, or sadly, as that UK study showed, they're not even seeing the night sky in urban settings. And this loss is happening quickly and potentially impoverishing us as a species. So we're really not connecting to understand what climate change is to do anything about it. And if we're worried about it without understanding it, that's a problem. So I'm advocating that to work with children, we get them interacting with nature to understand what it is. We can't be saving nature if we're not interacting with nature. Let's go to the next slide. So what we need is some of that connection, that simple engagements with nature are strongly linked to conservation action and personal well-being. And the kind of connection that makes a difference isn't just about spending time outdoors. It's about actively tuning into nature. So regularly spending those simple, bite-sized moments relating to the nature around us, recognizing birds, understanding the different types of dragonflies we're seeing, all those wonderful things that we have around us everywhere, understanding the different tactile things, how leaves feel. So if we're going to tackle this crisis, then we need a closer connection and a new relationship with nature. And that includes us here in Singapore. Let's go to the next slide. So what I'm advocating here as well, to work with children, we could just start on a 9-week journey, and some of you might already be doing this, but it can start with as little as 20 seconds to 2 minutes. And I wouldn't say doing this once a week, doing it a few days a week, but just simply listening to birds or leaves and touching bark and trees. Week 2, extending a few more minutes, smelling trees and flowers, watching clouds. Week 3, extending a few more minutes, spending time watching bees and butterflies and dragonflies and starting to notice, the ones that hover and the ones that flutter and the ones that come back to the same branch or grass. And you can see that these all have sensory components. It's listening, it's smelling, it's watching, the tactile nature of it. So all of those things can help us understand nature more. So what we're going to go now to the next slide is we're going to go to week 4, when now we're starting to get creative in nature. If we draw and share a picture of nature, that actually connects us cognitively as well, thinking about it in other ways, observing patterns of light, moving on, actually spending time following ant trails, getting down into the tiny, really close observations. And by week 6, maybe getting active and going for a walk or a jog or a run in nature. Next slide. And by week 7, we're starting to really find things to observe. So a flower that we love, or even getting close enough and spending time enough with an animal that we could sketch them. So that could involve, a longer time. Taking time to walk slowly up a hill and give you a reward at the end. What will be that view as we come to the end of it? Think of it unfolding as something very, wonderful to see. We may get out and engage in a cleanup activity by picking up litter at a local park or at the beach, doing pro-environmental behaviours and telling, explaining to children how that connects with environments and with climate. We might get creative with wild art and giving a gift to nature by creating a mandala with leaves. And by week 9, we can find a comfortable spot to sit and observe and just really engage and just be in nature for 20 to 30 minutes. So going from that 20 seconds to begin with to actually spending more time in nature will help us engage more and actually interact more with nature. And final slide, because I know I'm running out of time. Our nature immersion practices here in our very densely urban environment in Singapore do require the continuing presence of quality green spaces in which biodiversity is preserved and actively appreciated. So let's all get together and make sure we advocate strongly to retain these beautiful green spaces that are so important to us here in nature, and let children have something to admire in the coming years. And I leave it over to my colleague Natasha to give you the more clinical approach to this. That's it for me.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Denise. I really enjoyed that. I think I really want to try the 9 weeks to nature and self. I'm gonna start at week 1 with bird song, I think. All right. So my talk is really going to focus on that, more of the managing the climate anxiety. And um, Burke et al., they did a review of the psychological impact of climate change. And I put it here because I think they put it very nicely when they explain why understanding this is so important for our children. It's because our children are going to be the ones who face the consequences of climate change in their lifetime. So we want to know how they will be impacted and reduce the impact. Number two, they will need to adapt to very rapid change. So we want to support their knowledge building. And three, they are going to be the future leaders of our society. So we definitely want to support their self-regulation in decision making, making those good decisions for themselves and for the future as well. So in trying to sort of find out, I guess, like knowledge-wise, more about climate change in Singapore. Sorry, I think my slide just moved. It became smaller. Is that okay? Okay. All right. So climate change definitely exists in Singapore. This is just a snapshot of what some of the effects of climate change are. So firstly, I think the most noticeable for us, is the daily temperature increase. So daily mean temperatures are projected to rise to about 4.6 degrees Celsius. And that's going to affect our plants, our animals, our ecosystem. And this temperature increase, of course, if you're looking at that second column right there, is that it's going to lead to warm days and nights. And so this is going to affect us in ways like increases in vector-borne diseases like dengue. We're already feeling the stress from the heat. So there's going to be a lot of discomfort, especially among the elderly and the sick. It will also affect things that are quite common in Singapore, like eczema management as well. And of course, once the temperature rises, there's going to be greater use of air conditioning, and that's going to increase Singapore's energy demands, and that's going to result in higher domestic carbon emissions as well. And then if we're looking at that rainfall and wind column, those are also going to cause issues for us, because intense rainfall that overwhelms our drainage system, it can lead to flash floods. And of course, sea level rising definitely affects us, because Singapore is, of course, a low-lying island, and the rise in the sea level poses that most immediate threat to us. So I don't know about you guys, but when I was gathering all that data for that particular slide, like I could feel the anxiety sort of creeping up in my body. So anxiety is actually a threat. It's a danger alert system that we have. So when we see threat, it's supposed to activate like our entire body, including our thoughts. For example, we may start having kind of like, it's meant to prepare us, like, hey, something's not right, like do something. And then it also fills our body with certain kinds of sensations, urges. And so we have a name for that called anxiety. And it's driving us to a certain kind of action, which is actually to avoid or escape from danger. So that's essentially what anxiety is all about. It's actually a very adaptive thing that's meant to protect us. But sometimes what happens is that it can get maybe a little bit out of control. So it's for us to kind of like, I guess, develop that ability in ourselves. So if we're kind of thinking about, well, what are the experiences actually of maybe youths in terms of climate anxiety? So Hickman did a study that involved 10 countries, including an Asian one, Philippines. So young people have very limited control over their lives, including climate change. So once you sort of feel like you have limited control over something, that can increase anxiety. So there's a high number of negative thoughts that these youths reported. Over 75% had thoughts like the future is frightening. Over 83% have thoughts like people have failed to take care of the planet. They also talked about unpleasant emotions that they were feeling. So the common ones were sad, anxious, angry, powerless, feeling helpless, guilty, betrayed. And 84% were at least moderately worried, and 59% were very or extremely worried. So these are youths who are sharing with us the kinds of thoughts that come to them, and the kinds of emotions that they feel when they're thinking about climate change. So what can we do? Now I put here as a slide like what can parents do, but I think it's any kind of adult in a child's life can really use some of these strategies. So first and foremost, we really want to learn about emotions as a way to self-regulate. That means that we learn to regulate ourselves so that we can then co-regulate with our children. Because they're still very young, we cannot expect them to self-regulate. That's something that really, like, they really start developing more at the adolescent level. So when they're quite young, we want to be able to co-regulate with them. So one of the ways that we can do it is start learning more about emotions. So firstly, emotions are actually names for automatic sensations and urges. So you have sensations like heart rate rising, you feel, you might be sweating, you feel warm, you could be tearing up, you could feel dizzy. And it's also followed by this urge, like an urge to want to do something. So for example, I could have an urge like I want to slap someone, or like slam the door, or like bang the table. And something is important to remember is that without co-regulation or self-regulation, children tend to follow that urge. So what we can do is help our children put a name to their sensations and urges. This allows them to increase their emotional vocabulary. So it also helps them to connect their biology. So things that are just happening automatically to them as part of their danger alert system, you're connecting that to an emotion word, and maybe also some kind of logic or thoughts as it pertains to the situation. So for example, if a child's coming to you to talk to you about like feeling uneasy, ways that you can reflect might be saying something like, okay, your teacher told you today about the rising sea levels and you started feeling anxious. You noticed that your heart was beating fast, and maybe you felt like escaping or running away, or just maybe wanting the teacher to even just keep quiet because you don't want to hear her talk about it anymore. So we want to be able to name those sensations and urges for them. 2 is to know that all emotions have functions. They drive us to action. I think sometimes we think about negative or positive emotions. We can kind of reframe that to think about it as emotion. Some emotions we experience negatively, some emotions we experience positively. But what's more important is really what's the function of it and how it's meant to actually help us. So for example, feeling sad might drive us to seek help, like ask for help or seek solace. Feeling angry, it also is a drive to action. So like, for example, getting justice for the wronged. And even guilt has a reason. So it's a function that maybe helps us repair relationships by seeking forgiveness. So what we kind of want to do is help our children see the function of their emotions. So even explaining to them, like, your anxiety is maybe telling you like something's not right, there's some kind of danger and it wants to protect you from it. And number 3, all emotions are acceptable. So this is a big one because I think sometimes it's very hard to separate emotions from behaviors. But what we kind of want to do is actually give a space where emotions are acceptable, and we want to accept and verbally validate their emotional experience. So for example, you feel angry because we increased the aircon temperature to 25 degrees. Like, you want the room to be cooler. Like, that's understandable. And if we can remember, try to choose self-regulation and co-regulation over being punitive. So being punitive can cause shame, which is linked to poorer mental health. So what we can kind of do is place reasonable limits on behaviors after accepting emotions, and use logical consequences if possible. So for example, if they break something, or maybe they were, had acted in an aggressive or rude way towards someone, we want to focus on helping them repair the objects or repair the relationship in some ways. The other thing that's important is thoughts. So I think I talked quite a bit about thoughts. And I think one of the things that, I talked a lot about emotions, but thoughts are just as important. And we want to learn about thoughts as a way to self-regulate and then co-regulate with our children. So I just want to put it out there also that trying to sort of have that stance of all thoughts being acceptable. So thoughts are actually quite automatic and immediate. We can't control their occurrence. They sort of just, like pop into our minds. So some of the things we can do is we can teach our children about first thoughts and second thoughts. In fact, we can even teach ourselves about it. So first thoughts are our immediate and automatic kind of reaction to things, like immediate thoughts of like, if, you saw that you were walking out and then you saw that it was gray clouds, your first thought is that, oh no, like I got to go get my umbrella or something. Okay, that's a pretty neutral example. But That's a first thought that just pops in your mind. Second thoughts gives us a chance to evaluate our first thoughts and create a second perspective of viewing a situation. So for example, if I'm noticing like my anxiety when I was trying to find out more about climate change, and my first thought was genuinely oh no, I think we're screwed. Like that was my first thought. But if I can sort of have an observer perspective and step back and go, okay, so that's my first thought, that happens automatically. What second thoughts can I kind of have to think more broadly about the situation? So do be open and inviting so that children feel safe to share their first thoughts with you. Try and acknowledge instead of dismiss. So for example, this is quite normal for us to say when we say, oh, don't worry about it. Like there's nothing to worry about. Don't even like think about it at all. But what we kind of want to try is maybe acknowledging it that instead, like, hey, that does sound scary. And, thanks for sharing your thoughts with me. So to further kind of talk about teaching our children to evaluate their first thoughts and where possible use knowledge and objectivity to create second thoughts, I just want to put it out there as well that the aim is to increase their perspective, not convince or force them to accept the second thoughts. So we want to validate their first thoughts and then, sort of just broaden their horizon a bit and offer different kinds of perspectives and just let it sink in. So some examples are if children are worried about things like dengue and that we're living in the red zone, like Topayo Lorong 1, you can acknowledge any kinds of first thoughts that they would have, like, oh, I'm going to get dengue and I'm going to die or something. Acknowledge that, but also take the opportunity to give them information that can help them develop second thoughts, like telling them about search and destroy operations or new tools like the wolf back here, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, and also community engagement, like when NEA goes around to visit households to check on like dengue danger. So even in terms of energy, like you can have discussions about efforts to reduce carbon emissions and water especially. I think that's very rampant in the schools where they talk a lot about water conservation efforts. So those are some ways that we can kind of expand our children's second thoughts. And I just want to put it out there that after having said all of that, do practice compassion for yourself. Things that I've shared, you're not meant to do it 100% of the time. Nobody can 100% be self-regulated and 100% co-regulate. So just try out some of these things and just go at the pace that is comfortable for you. All right, so I've come to the end. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to talk more about this.
Wow. Those are such thought-provoking presentations. Thank you, Denise. Thank you, Natasha. I think one thing that really caught me when Denise, you were talking about the different, taking that small steps, over weeks and building your appreciation of nature and also like the tactile touch. And you talked about watching clouds, and suddenly it reminded me when I was young, that was really something that we used to do either at the beach or when we're even just swimming in a pool that's entirely man-made. We spend time just like lying on our backs, just like, oh, that looks like a turtle, or that cloud looks like something else. And it just didn't quite occur to me how long it's been since I've done that myself. So so that's really cool. There are lots and lots of questions. Thank you very much for our audience. And I wanted to make sure that we try to address as many as possible. And so I'm going to combine some of these. Some of them are coming from different channels. We're live streaming on Facebook, on YouTube, and on LinkedIn. So today, I think I'll start with one question that is very specific to that part of your presentation, Denise, about the 9 weeks. Is there any age group that you feel this is actually applicable to, or actually just among that 9 weeks, there's just so many things that can be done across a large spectrum of age groups?
It isn't so much an age group as how disconnected are you from nature, I think. And if you're more disconnected from nature, the more applicable it is. So some people, I think, would find it actually a struggle to spend even 20 seconds listening to birdsong. And I did do an interview with a freelance reporter some years ago, and I gave him this challenge, and he took it on himself to actually follow the challenge. And he said he did struggle for the first 2 weeks, spending even a few minutes doing things. But over time, because he was persistent, he said he did come to appreciate it. And he was in a very urban environment. There was only a sparse one small tree that he could do, but he connected with that tree over the 9 weeks. So any age group is my I think children would probably find it easier than adults, I have to say.
Yeah, maybe that's definitely true. And I think connected to this that you just mentioned is a more general question that one of our viewers has asked, is whether or not this being in a high urbanized area, is this loss of connection quite clinically or from a research perspective associated with increase in mental health issues? Like, is there research that demonstrates that? And how do we, and of course, some of your suggestions are already trying to help us reconnect with nature. So I think that's the first question, is the loss of connection with nature demonstratively increasing mental health issues possibly?
I think this is an important one to really tease out, because it's important that we don't pathologize things like climate anxiety that are very, it's natural to be anxious about some things. And so where Natasha's coming from is very much clinically diagnosed mental illness. And a lot of the discourse about this now seems to just associate any type of anxiety with a mental illness, and that's not the case at all. And so what we're finding in a lot of the research is that definitely psychological well-being can be enhanced through nature connectedness. There is a definite association there. But I don't see that there's any necessarily rise in mental health issues that are really associated so far with loss of nature. It can happen for anybody that you might have an extreme reaction to something, and that could be part of some other associated mental illness that's already there, sitting in the background, and this triggers. So I think what I'm looking at more so is the positive connection, that if we can connect with nature, we can enhance psychological well-being.
Yeah, I
Natasha,
think to sort of follow up on that, like exactly what Denise said, is that when we look at these studies as well, they're looking at this correlation. So what you're seeing is that, okay, maybe as something goes up, your anxiety levels are related to higher levels of anxiety. But when they say higher levels of anxiety, it doesn't mean pathological levels. It just means it's just like it increases, that's it. So if we're looking at those kinds of studies as well, we're just looking at things that can maybe make it like reduce or increase your anxiety, but it's still within that acceptable range, not at like clinical levels. Yeah, so that's something to remember as well.
Great, thank you. There's another question. There's another group of questions here that was actually in relation to a loss of environment and what you were talking about for morning rituals and the role that they can play. But also I'll put them together, and then I think actually both of you might have thoughts around that. You were talking about glaciers and mourning of glaciers, but I think one of our viewers is reflecting that actually in Singapore there are many people who feel a sense of loss because their kampongs or their traditional villages in the past had actually been destroyed because they wanted to make way for HDB build up and also other more concentrated living situations. And this is not just a loss of space, it's also a loss of memory and also loss of tradition. And when you talked about the role of mourning rituals, is there, if we were to do that, how would we use the right tone so that the youth or the children will actually be able to process this anxiety or process this loss in a positively? Like, is it meant to take a celebratory nature, for example? What are some of the considerations that we should take when thinking about this?
I think that's fantastic combination of questions. And it's important that it isn't a complete celebration, because it's important that we do acknowledge the mourning. We're trying to find a resolution, so we need to accept that there has been a loss. And I think that's a very important point. And in Singapore, this is kind of a great connecting opportunity, I think, for children to hear the stories from their grandparents. And I think for grandparents, that would be a wonderful opportunity to reflect and to help them think about what they gained. As I say, we always gain something from our environments. And what did they lose from what was, the kampong? They could explain to children what the kampong spirit is and how the environment is a part of that. Because I think now what we're seeing is the kampong spirit is people coming together. But I find it so important that it is that reflection on the way the environment was back in the old times. And so it could be partly that we start with a sense of the loss and what was there, and the reflection of how important that was, and then start in the ritual, in the structured ritual, coming to something of a celebratory sense, so that the children don't get tied up in that mournful way. And it could help also the elderly come to a sense of, and I think a lot of elderly are very resilient in this way. They've had time to come to a sense of that, well, it's gone, we can't replace it. But the way that they overcome it could actually help children and model to them how that occurs as well. So as for the tone, I think it could, as I say, definitely start with helping children. Natasha could probably help here understand the emotions associated with loss and the cognitions, the thoughts associated with loss. But then it's like funerals, at a wake, we don't always want to be miserable. We actually want to celebrate the life of the person in some way as well. So it could be celebrating the wonderful things that happened in the kampongs and how we might integrate them into our lives today.
Yeah, I think that's I don't know what else I could expect on that. That was very beautifully answered. It's I would say it's both. I think it's nice to kind of see the duality in something. So, I think me and Denise actually were just talking about how worry was associated with hope as well. So we don't sort of just want to go into something and then just be like, okay, worry, full stop. But behind the emotions, there's this other kind of emotions as well. So there's worry, there's hope, there's sadness for what has been lost, but also that hope for the future, and maybe even happiness in some ways that because of this loss, people are coming together, So it's just having those kinds of conversations, and it depends on the age of the child as well. Obviously, if they're much younger, in preschool, simpler language and just talking. Actually, something nice about children is that they can lead the way. They'll be the ones telling you. So when they share, I think what they really need from us as adults is to listen. I think sometimes a lot we want to sort of like tell them not to worry, or we might want to like influence them with our own thoughts. I think allow the children to give us actually some insight. I find that in working with, whether it's preschool, primary school, secondary school, sometimes the things that they just say can really blow you away. So just practice that listening and hearing what it is that they have to say. Because I think as very young children, they don't get a lot of say. They don't get a lot of time to tell you about their opinions. They're very academically oriented, and it's always like, just tell us what to do, we'll do it. Okay, we'll listen. So that part of it, I think, is to allow them to really just talk and for us to listen.
Thank you. It's really interesting to think about duality and the process to make it clear, or to be able to find ways to articulate it. I think sometimes we were when you juxtapose worry and hope, I think it's sometimes quite hard to just walk away from the worry and then think about the hope. I think there needs to be some instigator or someone else that can help them or even help us as adults see that, right? Sometimes. Quite
Yeah.
interestingly, another viewer mentioned that because of the sea level rise and Singapore's plan for coastal protection, I think there will be another round of very clear loss of space and loss of or changes to a place that we're very familiar with. And so that maybe there is an opportunity for us to think about what is it that we do now. A lot of people probably didn't have the opportunity in the past to think about how you would memorize a kampong that has been lost, but maybe now we have opportunities to think about what we could do to be able to collectively remember a place, and build on that through generations.
And
There
I
are a
think
couple of
that's starting to happen already. Sorry, Xin Ying, but
yes.
with the Semakau, the people that have had to be relocated, they've already had
Yes.
to deal with that as well. And it's very recent, like, in our own
Yes.
generation that's happening. And we've lost coastline here because it's all been modified. We don't have mangroves that were there before that. The people who
Yeah.
were here that relied on them, they're already lost.
Yeah, it's true. So you mentioned the original people who lived in Pulau Semakau. So SG Orong Laut as an organization is the one that's really thinking about how to make sure the memories of that space, that place, the memories and also the practices and the traditions of a sea reliant traditions are really preserved or remembered, hopefully in some way continued practicing. So if anybody is interested in that, you can check out the SG or Orang Laut group. There are a few more questions here. I think there's one in particular that maybe I will keep to the closing. But here there's a question about children and teens that is there who do experience extreme climate anxiety. Um, is there a good source for understanding the research on uh, what's how this might differ from other types of anxiety disorders? Is there really some difference in that,
I think
or
if we're looking at it very like diagnostically, and we go to, like, let's say for example the current text on diagnostic disorders and things like that, climate anxiety wouldn't really fall under that. But that fear of, like, what was that term, like, when they're scared of like earthquakes happening, or they're very worried about like climate related things, it can fall under that. They might have a predisposition to maybe some generalized anxiety, so they're predisposed to that worry, and then for them it could be that they latch on to this, like the climate to them. So in some sense it could fall under that, and it's already something that's quite understood. So the thing actually about anxiety is that it's such a well-researched disorder if it's at that disorder level. So all those similar strategies would apply. I don't think necessarily that it would be something very much different. Although if there are any climate anxiety experts here in terms of managing that at that level, do chime in. But from my knowledge about anxiety disorders themselves is that they they're kind of related in that way. And there's, although many years and decades have come, most of the strategies kind of are generally the same thing and repackaged. So it might just kind of fall under more of that worries, that generalized anxiety of like something to worry about, and they could have maybe latched on to climate anxiety as their thing.
does then helping children or teens figure out how to take action, how to be positive change makers, is that actually helpful to the management of their anxiety? And the question here actually is that, beyond helping them to cope with the anxiety, what else do we need to do to kind of equip them then to become a
Oh.
more positive change makers, or to become useful or positive change makers, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah. I would say just go at their level and pace it. Because the thing about anxiety is that it's a need also for control. Like when I feel anxious about something, I kind of want to like pull all my plans and hyper focus and like not feel anxious, right? So I think part of it is also helping our children understand it a bit better and then guiding them. So I have an example. We were out that day, me and my children at the playground. You know how hot Singapore is, and my son was starting to get quite distressed. He was like, "It's very hot. We need to go home. Like, it's very hot. We need to go home." And then he just goes, "Has it always been this hot? What was the temperature like last year?" Like, because he was just like, "I don't want to wear this hat anymore. I'm sweating." And so I think look for those opportunities where children do bring up stuff. Like when they maybe complain and say, "How come we cannot on the aircon?" Or like, "It's so hot, we need to go home." Like those are actually very nice opportunities, because sometimes we just don't think about it. We're like, stop complaining. But those are very nice times to kind of go, "Hey, yeah, actually, has it increased?" Like, so I tried, I think, especially with this whole talk that I had to do, it became like at the forefront of my mind. And so I was like, let's look into this. And we were watching some YouTube videos on like the temperature rising, which he was like, "See, I told you it's getting hotter. This means we shouldn't go out, at this times." But so that's that worry part. But I think then we tried to talk a little bit more about, well, what can we do? Because we do like being out. And what are some of the ways that we can kind of see whether we can have, even minute impacts on stuff. So it's about looking at, well, please remember to off the toilet light after you step out from it. Or like, when you're washing your hands, please like off the water when you're like soaping it. So those are, I think, very nice moments. And he felt like it was doable for him at his age. He's 8, and then it was relevant to him because he brought it up. He was like, "This weather is getting out of control," right? So I think my learning point there is almost like, not that I want to force feed somebody, like go save water, go do this, go do that. But if you can find those opportunities that these little young ones bring up, that might be a nice avenue to validate their experience, but maybe try to also guide them on what we can do together.
I would add to that, Natasha, flip that around and spend more time in the outdoors and do the 9 weeks, but take them into shady areas where there's breeze and say, well, look what the outdoors can actually give us. And take the difference of, well, some places it's very hot, yes. But if we have cities that have lots of trees and that still allow breezes and that can get cooling, and we can find wonderful flowers and we can see birds and butterflies, we can hear the sounds of nature, maybe that might entice him to not focus on the heat and think about the other parts of nature, what climate really is.
Yes, that's so good.
Make people a change advocate through saying we need to preserve this. So how can we preserve it?
I like that. So I think that's where the knowledge bit comes in, right? Like where you are sharing with me, actually, let's broaden our minds and then sort of like look around and see, well, now we're in this situation, what can we do to notice other things? I really like that. I think something that
and if we foster hope, it can actually translate into positive action as well.
Yeah, I love that. And thanks for that idea. It's going to be
9
helpful.
weeks.
I think the other thing that's quite nice, I think in my work with parents, is that I had done some research before on how children use their time. So parents are, I think now they're trying to like follow the new rules, which is like reduce screen time. And I think myopia is like a very big thing. I find that those are actually, in some sense, very good drivers of getting kids out into nature and the greenery and all that, because that's like the common theme. Parents are all, like the parents I know I have worked with are always thinking like, I need to reduce screen time. And that somehow has been helpful in propelling them out of the house and going to like East Coast Park, going to Botanic Gardens, going to all those things, because I don't know, it's just a unique thing that I realized out of Singapore is the myopia problem that's sort of helping up the climate.
Very cool.
Oh, yes, today's the full moon. Somebody noticed. Yes, we noticed it. Yay.
Well, spend some time looking at the moon, because in the Chinese legends, you're supposed to be able to see a shape of a rabbit in the moon, the shadow of a rabbit in the moon. So when I was young, that was what we used to do during full moon, especially during the Mooncake Festival. There are some questions that actually came through when folks were registering, so I thought we would take some opportunity to address it here. I think this particular question on how one should introduce the topic of climate change, I think we just now talked a little bit about how to encourage action, especially when something is outside a child's sphere of control. But another part of this question was about whether or not we should think about downplaying its effects. Like, is there anything that says, because it can feel really scary for some children, that we should be quite cautious about how we talk about the effects of climate change?
I would advocate that for very young children, it doesn't need to be related to climate change. It's just getting out in nature and understanding what climate is, what seasons are, and we can start using and introducing that language to ourselves. We've lost a lot of the language and understanding ourselves. As I said earlier, we tend to deny that there are seasons here, but we can start talking about, well, even thinking about memories. Well, when did that happen? It happened at the time of the monsoon season in that year. And people and kids can start to appreciate that, yes, there are times of year that things are different, and that's climate, and start talking to them. As I said, here we're in the shade, how much cooler it is than when we were out in the sun. This is what happens when we're in cities where we can still have nature, and it's associated with climate. And I think it's those interactions that can start getting them to understand. And as they get older, you could start to integrate more of the knowledge stuff about what people could do. For very young children, though, I've had people on forest therapy walks with me. I had a really young boy who was wonderful. He wanted to start picking up rubbish the whole way, and so that was his nature walk. He just wanted to help nature by picking up rubbish. And I would encourage, if anyone wants to do that, fine, but it's not essential. It depends on the child.
Cool. Thank you. I have two more questions here towards the end. The first one is about the idea of ecophilia and what educational institutions could be doing, or what role they could be doing to develop this love for nature.
I think some institutions are already doing it quite well. They even have gardens in the schools. I know in Singapore, several schools have introduced gardens, and they use it as part of their curriculum to understand biology, different scientific processes, for instance. And so I think that could be encouraged more. And part of it could be that, again, using the language of nature and looking at the patterns of what happens in this particular month and how does it change from month to month, and understanding that things do change over a year and over, even weeks at a time. But what we're thinking then is more globally, and we can't expect children to understand everything. We ourselves don't understand everything. So the educational institutions can play a part, but I think we as parents, I'm not a parent myself, by the way, but start to develop our own language of talking about nature in a way that is related to nature, and not just referring to trees, but, oh, look at that beautiful Angsana tree, and not just looking at the stars, but I think that actually might be Mars up there tonight, thinking about the planets as they move through the sky. You can even get apps now that show you what the stars are. If you don't know, you can actually learn. So the more we integrate ourselves with nature, I think the more we can start to educate the children and not just leave it up to educational institutions.
Yep. So a lot more holistic approach that, whoever the child is with, they have the opportunity to feel a connection to nature, no matter whether it's the stars, whether it's the water, and things like that. Yeah. Cool. We're towards the last minute of the live stream. And there's a question here that I wanted to leave towards the end, because today we talked a lot about how people are reacting to very strong emotions, right? And Natasha, you talked about not just thinking about this as emotions, but remembering how we think about first thoughts and second thoughts. There's a question here about what do we do about people who are not anxious at all? But I think in a way, I also wanted to kind of understand this question, right? Is there, that there are people who feel like there's nothing that they could do, and so why bother? And I guess maybe from my lexicon as a non-psychologist, is that a demonstration of apathy? Where might it come from? Could it actually be related to other types of emotional response? And instead of that emotion leading to a particular type of action that we thought it led to apathy. What could we do about that?
I'm not sure if there's anything to really do about that. I think it's not so much about that they're not anxious at all, but it could be that they're not anxious about the climate change, for example. So I think I want to go back to this idea that everyone's thoughts and emotions are acceptable. So that is genuinely, I would want to start from that place of like just genuinely understanding that, hey, that's their genuine perspective. And not everybody might feel anxious about climate change, for example. So I just kind of want to also acknowledge that, and I would say focus the energy on that group, like the groups that are interested in climate change, that want to do that, because I think everybody has their own social justice cause, and some people just view it that way, like they want to view it logically, or this is the science behind it, so I've checked out. I think check out is a wrong word, but it's just something that's not at the forefront. Yeah, I think everybody's at a different stage or level, and I might not necessarily want to focus all my efforts to change somebody's mind. I would focus that energy instead on this whole community who's already, powering through that. Yeah.
Denise, any thoughts about that? Additional thoughts about that?
No, I think I can't follow Natasha's wonderful explanation.
Okay, good. Denise, you tell the truth. I was being politically correct.
All right. Thank you so much, Natasha and Denise. I think we covered a lot of ground today, and I think from the questions that were received from our viewers, definitely a topic that a lot of people have on their minds. But I think not just had you guys addressed like where some of these emotions might be coming from, but there were a lot of these very important tools in which we can find ways to manage it, find ways to daily practices in which we hopefully to connecting with nature, find a different way to manage that anxiety and also build the resilience, not just for our children. I think it's also for ourselves. I think we've come to a conclusion that a lot of adults in Singapore, including myself, have lost some of these practices that we did when we were much younger, connecting to nature. So thank you so much, both of you. There were a lot of insightful points that we can reflect upon. And thank you so much to our viewers who have stayed with us throughout the hour. As I mentioned, this is the second out of 5 of webinars that we at Climate Conversations, together with SG Parents for Climate Action, is curating to address some of the concerns that parents have raised to us about the climate crisis. So thank you very much for your time. There will be another one next month in October. I think maybe early November, I believe. But there you go. That's the form for you to sign up. And the next webinar is really about how parents can be a role model for our children here in Singapore around things like personal choices when it comes to thinking about our role in climate crisis versus what does it mean for our daily lives in trading off some of the conveniences that we have and how challenging that might be. So thank you so much, Denise. Thank you, Natasha, and good night, everybody.
Thanks so much. Bye.